Why do we need so bad to be ready before we're allowed to speak? At what point did we collectively decide that only experts deserve a voice that's respected? Who actually benefits from us staying silent until we feel legitimate? I want to talk about credibility here, about imposter syndrome, and about why being a beginner is not always a weakness, but quite often your biggest strength. So I do hope that this episode is going to be quite relatable for you, especially if you're learning something at the moment, building something, becoming someone new, but that you feel somehow like you're not allowed to talk about it yet because you're not quote unquote ready. So welcome to this fifth and last episode of a series on becoming everything. Welcome to The Bold Beginner, the space where you get to feel seen and heard, and where you're reminded that starting over is not a failure. This is your space to breathe, to mess up, to try again, and to take it slow. And to remember that you're allowed to reinvent yourself as many times as you need. And if you're ready to take back control of your life, you're in the right place. Before going any further, a quick reminder, if you're enjoying this series and you want to support the podcast, make sure that you're subscribed wherever you're listening, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the good stuff. It really, really helps this project grow, and it makes sure that you don't miss the next episode. All right, now let's get back to it. So first, I want to talk about the myth of being ready. I talk about it a lot because that's something that's so deeply ingrained in our brain. That's something that we're being sold all the time, that first you learn, then you master, and only then you're allowed to share. Whereas what happens in real life is that readiness comes from movement, from action. And I would even go further and say that readiness is a moving target, because the more you move forward, it's almost like the least you feel ready. The more you learn, the more you realize that you don't know much about the topic or about whatever you're learning. And so what it translates to is that waiting for it to happen, waiting to be ready, often means never showing up. Because in practicality, you will most likely never feel ready. I'm pretty sure I would bet that a lot of experts still don't feel like they are as legit as other experts. So us saying, I'll wait until I'm ready, I'm waiting to be ready, it's often just rooted in our fear, because we're terrified to show up and we're terrified to actually talk about what we're learning or how we do things imperfectly. So obviously it comes from perfectionism as well, because we are scared not to be perfect. And it comes from social comparison, because you are worried that someone else is going to do better than you, is going to be better than you at doing something. So it's rarely very internal. It's more like a social construct. And the bottom line is that I don't think that most people are scared of being bad. I think that they're scared of being seen before they're excellent. Because if you were scared of being bad, you wouldn't have started in the first place. The fact that you're ready to be a beginner already tells that you're ready and that you don't mind being bad for yourself, but you're worried that people are going to think you're bad. And so all that ties very tightly to imposter syndrome, which is common for many people. But I'll say this is that it's even more common for women and even more amplified for multipotentialites. And I've actually learned something quite recently as of to why it's so common for multipotentialites to have this very strong imposter syndrome. And that's actually explained from the discrepancy between the fact that you already have skills and you know that you have those skills, but most of the time what you want to share is things that are outside of your comfort zone, because multipotentialites get very excited to always learn more, be very multifaceted, become beginners again and again and learn new things. And they get excited about those topics that are very much outside of their comfort zone. So internally, there's a mismatch, right? Because I'm competent here, but I'm a beginner there, and I actually want to share what's there. And so obviously you feel illegitimate, because that tension creates guilt, it creates self-doubt, and the very strong feeling of who am I to talk? That's something I've been working a lot on the past few years. That's actually also why I'm doing this podcast right now. I've started this podcast because I've worked hard on reframing this obstacle in my mind, because what I came to the conclusion of is that feeling like an imposter doesn't mean that you lack skills. If anything, it means that you're brave enough to keep growing. And so instead of choosing a path that may be a bit more comfortable because you keep learning deeper and deeper in an area, an industry, whatever that you are already familiar with, you choose a very tough path and an unknown path to grow and to learn more about different things you're not familiar with. And if you've been listening to the prior episodes, and if you haven't, I encourage you to, you're probably used to it by now. That's the point where I often go to, you don't have to choose one identity. And that's the case in this scenario too, because I'm definitely not here to say that experts are bad and beginners are good. Both are extremely valid, both are needed, and both can coexist. But I'm just kind of making it my duty to give a bit more credit to generalists, to people who make it a point to be forever beginners, and to insist on the fact that you don't stop being legitimate because you're not an expert. The only thing is that it makes you legitimate at a different depth. You definitely don't have expert level depth, and that's completely okay. Because to someone who's just starting at something, you are still the expert. You're just not the expert for everyone, and that's completely fine. I like to make this theory very visual with what I call the 0% to 15% rule, because I think it's a pretty powerful model. So basically, if you have a scale of like 0% to 100% in terms of your expertise at something, you don't need to be at 100% to share whatever you're learning, whatever you're doing. Sometimes being at 15% is more than enough, because if you're at 15%, you can help someone who's at 0% and who wants to get to this 15%. Obviously, you can't help someone who's at 70%, which is completely fine. Obviously, you're not going to go to someone who knows far better than you and tell them that you're going to help them, or even you want to share with them what you've learned because they're going to learn from you. Obviously, they won't. But is that really a problem? Not really, because not everyone needs or even wants to go to 100%, and not everyone needs the same guide. And I'd go even further, saying that sometimes someone who's at 15% is often more appropriate to guide someone who's at 0%. Because when you're at 15% only at whatever you're learning, you remember the fears, you remember the confusion, you remember the emotional, the mental blocks that you felt yourself when you were at 0%. You haven't forgotten what it feels to start, and you speak the same language. Usually they say that experts often teach the destination, but beginners teach the journey. And just to mention a very concrete example that I love to talk about, because that's something that is very much part of my experience. A perfect example of this for me is a lot of dance teachers. Because a lot of dance teachers, and good for them, I kind of wish I had been able to do that, but they have started dancing when they were kids. They have started very young. They don't remember, or sometimes they've never actually known what it felt like to be very uncomfortable in your body, to feel awkward, to be in your head way too much, and to not just let go. And so the amount of time that I've been hearing teachers telling some people that have very strong mental blockage because they have had a very different upbringing, they don't know how to just be comfortable in their body, how to not be shy in this type of setup. And they would just tell students, it's easy, just let go. Just let go. Just go in the middle of the studio and just start dancing. When in fact, most of the time, it's actually the most difficult part for beginners. And so what happens is that experts, they oftentimes compress steps unconsciously because sometimes they've never known what it felt like to be a beginner, or they completely forgot. Whereas beginners, they explain the messy middle. And the messy middle is most of the time where most people quit. So that's actually priceless knowledge. So you see where I'm getting at here, right? Like a lot of people would tend to think that if I'm not an expert, then I have no voice. And that's completely wrong. Some people that genuinely believe that they have no credibility, no legitimacy, they don't deserve respect almost, unless they're experts. But you see with what I just explained before, that credibility doesn't equal perfection or mastery even. It's more a subtle combination of honesty, lived experience, and clarity about where you stand, about everything you've been through. So you don't lose credibility at all by saying, I'm still learning. I'd say you probably lose more credibility by pretending that you're not, pretending that you know it all. And I'll get to this in a minute because I want to clarify a couple of things. First of all, of course, I want to be very clear that I'm not talking about each and every area in this podcast episode, because there are some areas where actual deep expertise is absolutely essential. So we often take the obvious example of the surgeon. Obviously, you don't want a surgeon to be at 15% of knowledge. That's pretty obvious. Same goes with civil engineers. We're kind of happy to have solid bridges and, things that come from actual deep expertise. And of course, everything that I'm saying here is not at all about dismissing expertise. But it's just very important to me that both profiles are accepted and are recognized as legitimate, but both in different ways, like I explained before. Experts are essential, beginners are essential, but they serve very different purposes, obviously. And I also want to make another thing very clear, because it almost sounds like I'm saying, as a beginner, you can just share everything and anything. There are also topics that require deep understanding and nuance. Topics that cannot be simplified too much without becoming quite dangerous. So if I think of politics, for example, it's a pretty clear example for me, and especially with the rise of extremes as we're seeing them right now. In those areas, I'm actually the first one to say not everyone should have a mic. I think there's a lot of podcasts these days that just pretend to be knowing much more than they actually do. And here's the paradox. The main problem here is not people being honest about learning. The real problem is that in many of these complex fields, people pretend to be far more expert than they actually are. Instead of saying, I'm human, I'm just a human trying to understand something complex, and I'm trying to use my critical thinking, which I'm pretty sure everyone would be very forgiving of, they say, I know, I'm right, follow me. They become very strongly opinionated, often in dangerous ways, and they try to rally people around simplified and rigid narratives. And I think that's where it gets very dangerous. And I think that it's deeply ironic that these fake experts often gain respect and visibility. Meanwhile, inoffensive people who are simply sharing skills that they're not expert at, just to help complete beginners, they're mocked or dismissed. So down the line, I'm not here to say that we should be giving authority to everyone over everything. I'm just saying that humility should prevail over arrogance. And I would just like more people to understand that there's a huge difference between sharing a learning journey and claiming that we have the absolute truth, because it's not the same thing at all. I think I digressed a little bit, but I really wanted to clarify these 2 points because, I just didn't want to sound a certain way doing this episode. But back to expertism. In our society, I think that it's important to acknowledge one reality, that our society glorifies specialization for sure. A lot of times, titles, at least where I'm from, your title kind of becomes your identity. That's often one of the first questions that people are being asked. What do you do? Certifications, same thing, and extreme expertise. And I personally think that it's a shame that there's not more recognition for people who have a holistic understanding across domains. I know there's so many multifaceted people, so many multifaceted women out there that don't feel seen because they know they have some skills, but somehow because they're not ultra specialized in something, it's not being strongly recognized. Even though as multipotentialites, we connect the dots, we move faster, we adapt quicker, but somehow a lot of times it doesn't count. So that's why this topic is quite dear to me, because depth is powerful, that's undeniable. Like I said, I'm not here to discredit expertise. I couldn't even if I wanted to, but I definitely don't want to. Depth is powerful, but so is range. And I'm struggling to understand why it doesn't get more recognition. And so as usual, if there's one thing that I would love you to take away is that you don't need to be an expert. What you need the most, and that's very difficult these days, is to be honest about where you are. Because your voice still matters no matter where you stand. And sometimes, some people, they will not need expertise. They will need proximity. They will need to relate and to see someone who's becoming, who is in the process of. And so if you're learning, if you're growing, and you're not yet at the finish line, please share, please speak up, please raise your voice, because it does matter. And remember that your legitimacy really matters to people who are at 0%. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Thank you so much for those who've been listening to the whole series. I do hope that you enjoyed. Please share your thoughts in the comments. I would love to open conversations to know what your experience is, how you related, how you did not relate. And let me know, of course, if there are some episodes that you'd be interested, some topics that you'd love me to cover. I'm always extremely interested to open more conversations. And in the meantime, don't forget that your voice matters.